For 15 years, my whole family blamed me for losing my little brother, and I was never once cleared of it. The day my brother came home, I was pushed out of my own room to make space for a stranger wearing a real son's face. I quietly agreed to an arranged marriage just to get out of that house, never expecting my cold-blooded husband would be the one person willing to dig through old security footage to find out who really deserved to be punished. I opened my eyes at a dinner table so silent it was suffocating. Dim yellow light spread across the long wooden table, chopsticks clicking softly, no one bothering to speak. Dad sat at the head of the table, eyes locked on his phone, occasionally frowning like he was weighing some business deal. Mom attentively put food in Sue Han's bowl beside her, her eyes sliding over me and away again as if I were invisible. I lowered my head and ate in silence, the strangeness of this body making my fingertips tremble faintly. Sue Chen's memories flooded in like a tidal wave, pulling me under 15 years of unexplained blame. I gripped my chopsticks tight, trying to stay calm at this cold dinner table. The original owner's memories kept surfacing, clearer by the second. I had lost my little brother Sue Ang when he was 5, back when I was 8 and got put in charge of watching him at the downtown park. One distracted minute staring at a cotton candy stand, and he was simply gone. Police combed the city for a month, flyers everywhere, and still no lead. From that day on, the way my family looked at me changed completely. No one said it outright, but every raised eyebrow, every unfinished sentence, quietly confirmed the blame was mine. 15 years had passed, and that crack had never healed, only deepened with every silent meal like this one. The original owner used to sob alone in his room for who knows how many nights, kneeling outside our parents' door apologizing over and over. All that ever came back was a slammed door, colder eyes each day. The harder he tried to make up for it, the further the distance stretched. I set my chopsticks down, looked around this luxurious but emotionally empty dining room, and felt an unusual calm settle over me. In my last life, I'd worn myself out fighting for things. There was no reason to repeat that mistake now. I decided to let go completely, stop competing for affection, stop begging anyone in this house to acknowledge me, staying quiet, causing as little friction as possible. That was the safest choice I had left. The next morning I got up early, heading down to the kitchen before even the housekeeper. When Dad, Mom, and Sue Han came down for breakfast, I stood and bowed my head first, voice soft. I'm sorry for ruining the mood at dinner last night. All three of them froze for a beat, Mom's chopsticks stopping midair. Dad raised an eyebrow, looking me over like I was some strange creature. Sue Han set down his teacup, not bothering to hide his suspicion. No one answered my apology, only silence stretching until it turned awkward. I sat back down and kept eating, pretending not to notice the strange atmosphere hanging over the table. Sue Han waited until our parents had left the dining room before speaking, his voice low and suspicious. What's gotten into you today, Sue Chen, apologizing out of nowhere like that? I looked up at him and forced out a faint smile. I've been thinking, maybe I haven't been acting right before. Sue Han frowned, still doubtful but didn't push further. He stood, grabbed his bag, and shot me one last glance before heading for the door. Don't try anything? I bowed my head and murmured a small yes, quietly relieved that my first act had gone off without a hitch. The less attention people paid to my change, the easier my plan for a peaceful life would be. That afternoon, Dad called me into his study, his tone as flat as if he were discussing business. Your mother and I are thinking of sending you to England for a master's degree, a change of scene. I understood right away this was just a polite way to push me out of the house during a sensitive time coming up. The original owner would have fought this hard, convinced he was being cast aside, but I just nodded immediately, no hesitation at all. Yes, I think that's a good idea. Dad paused for a second, clearly not expecting me to agree so easily. He looked at me a few more seconds, then dropped his eyes back to the files on his desk, waving me off. I bowed and left the room, feeling nothing at all. That night, Dad's phone rang in the middle of dinner. He answered, his expression suddenly shifting, chopsticks trembling slightly in his hand. It was a private testing lab on the line, reporting a DNA match against the missing child file our family had submitted years ago. Dad shot to his feet, his voice cracking. "Say that again, are you certain?" The whole table went silent. Mom set down her bowl, hand shaking over her mouth. Sue had stopped eating too, turning to Dad with a questioning look. I sat still, feeling the air in the room turn suddenly dense. Something huge was about to happen, and I had no part in it at all. Dad hung up, stood frozen for a moment, then turned to Mom, his voice breaking. "It's Sue Ang. They found him?" Mom burst into tears right there, hands over her face, shoulders shaking. Sue Han froze, then rushed to hold her steady. Dad immediately called the family lawyer, demanding every record be verified that same night, his voice more urgent than I'd ever heard. The whole room dissolved into a chaos of relief and joy. I stood pressed against the wall, watching the scene like a complete outsider. 15 years of their waiting had finally paid off, except no one so much as glanced my way once. No one mentioned me at all that night. Our parents shut themselves in the study with the lawyer, Sue hand pacing back and forth on the phone. I went quietly back to my room and sat dazed on the bed. Near midnight, I overheard the housekeeper on the phone in the hallway, her whisper thrilled about the young master coming home. That was how I finally learned the full details, indirectly, since no one in the family had bothered to tell me directly. I lay down, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and didn't feel the hurt the original owner surely would have. Instead, I just felt relief. Maybe once Sue Ang truly came home, some of my 15-year burden of blame would finally ease. The next morning, Sue Han stopped me at the top of the stairs, his face unusually serious. "Sue Chen, your brother's coming home in the next few days. Behave yourself, don't cause a scene." His voice carried a clear edge of wariness, as if assuming I'd get jealous and start trouble. I bowed my head and answered obediently, without a hint of resistance. "I understand. I won't cause any trouble." Sue Han studied me a few more seconds, still doubtful, but eventually nodded and walked off. I stood there watching his back, feeling not a trace of resentment. All their precautions were unnecessary. I never had any intention of competing with the person about to return. The whole week after, the Sue family villa buzzed with activity. Staff cleaned out the largest bedroom on the second floor, ordered new furniture, boxes of new clothes in every size arriving one after another. Mom personally picked out every item, her face glowing with a smile I hadn't seen in years. Dad even held an internal company briefing to announce the joyful news of finding his lost son. I quietly watched it all unfold, occasionally helping to clean up when asked, never inserting myself into any decision. The anticipation in the air grew thicker by the day, as if the whole house were holding its breath for something enormous. The fateful afternoon arrived. A sleek black limousine pulled up outside the villa, the whole family already waiting outside 10 minutes early, no one hiding their nerves. The car door opened and a tall young man stepped out, handsome features, eyes darting curiously around the unfamiliar mansion. Mom rushed forward first, pulling him into a tight embrace, tears streaming without pause. Dad stood behind her, voice choked with emotion as he called out, "Sue Ang, my son." Sue had stepped up too, clapping the young man's shoulder like they'd known each other for years. I stood quietly at the edge of it all, watching the warm reunion play out right in front of me. Not one of them turned to introduce me to the person who had just walked through that door. Sue Ang was taken straight up to the largest bedroom on the second floor, a room prepared days in advance. The closet was stuffed with brand new designer clothes, tags still attached. The desk came equipped with the latest computer, the bookshelf arranged neatly according to guesses at his taste. Mom led him through every corner of the room, her voice full of unmistakable tenderness. "Anything you don't like, just tell me and I'll change it right away." Sue Ang nodded, eyes drifting over the room with faint satisfaction, as if all of it had always belonged to him. I stood at the door holding a tray of water, unnoticed until Mom glanced back, frowned slightly, and waved for me to set it down and leave. That evening, the family threw a small reunion dinner, inviting a few close relatives. The table was laid out lavishly, laughter filling the living room. Su Ang sat at the center, surrounded by everyone asking about his 15 years away. I sat at the far end of the table, next to an empty chair, no one bothering to introduce me to the newly arrived guests. Someone eyed me suspiciously and asked Mom under their breath, "Who's that?" But Mom just laughed it off and changed the subject without a direct answer. I ate in silence, feeling like a useless decoration at a lively party, sinking further into a corner no one paid attention to. Midway through dinner, Su Ang suddenly glanced my way, tilting his head to ask Mom, curious, "Mom, who's that? Why is he sitting alone at the end of the table?" The seemingly innocent question froze the whole table for a moment. Mom stiffened, her chopsticks stopping midair. Dad cleared his throat, trying to cover the awkwardness spreading across the table. Su hand glanced at me, then looked away without a word. A few relatives paused their eating too, curious eyes darting between me and Mom, waiting for an answer. The room's atmosphere turned suddenly stifling, a sharp contrast to the liveliness just seconds before. Mom stammered for a moment before finally speaking, forcing her tone to stay calm. "Oh, that's Su Chen, our former foster son." The answer was short, cold, as if talking about a stranger rather than a child who had lived in this house for 15 years. Su Ang nodded lightly, his eyes sweeping over me once before turning away, no interest whatsoever. "Ah, I see. Just 3 words, no greeting, no polite exchange at all." I sat still, forcing a faint smile, already used to being addressed that way. The party carried on as lively as before, as if that awkward moment had never happened, while I remained sitting quietly amid a liveliness that had never belonged to me. The party wound down near midnight, everyone drifting off to their rooms after an emotional day. No one remembered to clean up the scattered plates and wine glasses left across the table. The housekeeper had gone home that afternoon, leaving me alone in the empty living room. I took off my jacket, rolled up my sleeves, and began clearing the dishes one by one, a familiar routine. The soft clink of plates echoed through the quiet space, blending with the steady tick of the wall clock. I didn't feel any particular sadness or resentment, just treated it as another ordinary part of my daily life in this house, same as always. A few days later, I came back to my room after class to find all my belongings had been moved elsewhere. The bed, the closet, even my familiar old desk were gone, leaving the room bare and unfamiliar. I searched the house and found my things had all been dumped into the small storage room at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, a space previously used only for suitcases and unused junk. It turned out my old room had been cleared to make way for a private gym for Su Ang, at his request to Mom. No one had warned me about the change beforehand. I only discovered it after the fact, once it was already done. I stood in front of the cramped storage room, staring at my things piled messily in the corner. The tight space barely fit an old single bed, light seeping in through a tiny window in the corner. I felt no anger, made no move to confront anyone, just quietly began arranging my things into whatever little space remained. Some boxes stacked nearly to the ceiling, and I had to stand on my toes to fit them neatly. The work took nearly an hour before things felt reasonably settled. I sat down on the edge of the bed, looking around my new cramped little room, feeling nothing stir in my chest, just treating it as an inevitable rearrangement I had to accept. Su Han happened to pass by the 3rd-floor hallway and caught me struggling to organize things in that cramped storage room. He stopped, his expression flickering at the sight before him, his brows knit tight, lips pressed into a thin line, clearly displeased by something. I looked up and nodded a normal greeting, offering no further explanation. Su Han stood there a few seconds, seeming about to say something, but in the end just turned and walked away without a word. His footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving me alone with my half-unpacked belongings. At dinner that night, Dad suddenly stood up and announced something important, his voice full of pride. "I've decided to transfer 15% of the company shares into Su Ang's name to make up for 15 years apart." Su Ang lowered his head in a show of modesty, murmuring thanks, though a hint of triumph flickered hard to hide in his eyes. Mom clapped in approval. Sue hand nodding along with Dad's decision. No one at the table mentioned any share that once might have belonged to me, even though the original owner had once been promised something similar. I kept my head down and kept eating, picking up food calmly as if the whole matter had nothing to do with me. Su Ang suddenly turned toward me, the corner of his mouth curling into a hard-to-read smile. I heard you were the one watching me at the park back then. Guess someone wasn't paying close attention, huh? The seemingly casual remark struck like a needle straight into an old wound that had never healed. The whole table fell silent at once, Mom's chopsticks stopping, Dad looking up toward us. I could feel everyone's eyes waiting for my reaction. I took a deep breath, keeping my tone as calm as possible before answering his pointed question, careful not to let any flicker of emotion show on my face. I looked up and met Su Ang's eyes directly, my voice steady. Yeah, I wasn't watching closely enough. I'm sorry for what happened that day. I didn't explain further, didn't mention that I'd only been an 8-year-old handed a responsibility far beyond me. Su Ang raised an eyebrow, surprised by such a straightforward answer, as if he'd been expecting anger or denial instead. The table fell quiet again for a few seconds before Mom jumped in to change the subject and break the tension. I lowered my head and kept eating, feeling no anger or resentment at all, just wanting the whole thing to pass as quickly as possible. Late that night, I sat alone in the cramped storage room, moonlight spilling through the small window onto the uneven floor. I pulled an old suitcase from the corner and quietly began packing a few clothes and important documents. It wasn't that I planned to run away right away, I just understood how fragile my position in this house had become. Su Ang's arrival had truly made me feel more disposable than ever. I needed to be ready for anything, including the possibility of being thrown out of this house without any warning at all. A few days later, Dad called me into his private study, his expression unusually grave. He gestured for me to sit across from him, then slowly brought up an old debt of gratitude from years back. The Su family had once received major financial help from the Lu group during a crisis, a debt still unpaid to this day. The Lu family has proposed a marriage alliance to finally settle that old debt. I sat listening quietly, not understanding what this had to do with me until Dad looked me straight in the eye, his voice firm. The air in the study grew heavier than ever. Dad set down his teacup, his eyes avoiding mine. Su Ang just came home, still emotionally unsteady. He can't take on a marriage right now. He paused, then continued, his tone growing more decisive. You'll go in his place. The words fell like a verdict, no question asked, no answer expected. I looked at Dad, briefly picturing how the original owner would surely have fought hard against such an unfair decision. But I just nodded calmly, even surprising myself with how easily it came. This might just be my chance to leave this suffocating house with full legitimacy. Yes, I agree, I answered simply, no bargaining, no conditions attached. Dad paused for a second, clearly having braced himself to persuade or pressure me with all sorts of arguments. His face showed unmistakable relief, even a little surprise at how easily I'd agreed. He stood, patted my shoulder, his tone noticeably warmer than at the start of the conversation. Good, I'll arrange the meeting soon. I bowed and left the study, feeling not a trace of resentment toward the family's decision. The news spread through the house that very evening. Su Ang ran into me in the hallway, the corner of his mouth curling into a hard-to-read smile, whether mocking or sincere, I couldn't tell. Thanks for that, saves me a headache. His tone was light, as if talking about some trivial chore. I just nodded back, showing no particular reaction to the half-hearted thanks. A flash of satisfaction crossed Su Ang's eyes, unmistakable, as if pushing the burden of marriage onto me was simply the natural order of things. I turned and walked back to my room, not wanting to drag out that pointless exchange any longer. The meeting was arranged at one of the city's finest restaurants, on the top floor with a sweeping view of the glittering night skyline. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in the black suit Mom had hastily prepared over the past 2 days. A server led me into a quiet private room and set a glass of water on the table. I sat down, hands folded on my lap, trying to stay calm despite the nerves I couldn't fully shake. The rumors about the fiancé I was about to meet had echoed in my head for days, most of them centered on how cold and ruthless he was in business. Right on time, the door to the private room swung open. A tall man walked in, his straight posture radiating an overwhelming presence that seemed to still the whole room. His features were sharp, defined, his deep eyes carrying exactly the coldness the rumors described. I stood up quickly out of politeness, my heart racing a beat faster under the sheer weight of his presence. He looked me over for a few seconds, his expression unreadable, betraying no particular emotion. I bowed politely, trying to keep my voice from shaking under the pressure of his presence. He sat down across from me, unbuttoning his suit jacket unhurriedly, and spoke first, his voice unexpectedly gentler than his cold appearance suggested. "Sorry I'm late. The meeting ran longer than expected." I shook my head slightly. "It's fine, I only just got here myself." He called the server over for the menu, asking if I had any allergies or dietary restrictions, his thoughtfulness catching me off guard. I murmured that I had none, still watching him warily. The contrast between the cold rumors and this attentive reality left me quietly puzzled. "I'm Lu Jing." He introduced himself simply, his eyes meeting mine without hesitation. I gave my own name too, my voice still a little stiff, unused to the situation. The rumors about his ruthlessness in business, about how mercilessly he crushed rivals, still echoed in my head. Yet the man sitting across from me now radiated a completely different kind of calm, courteous presence. He poured water into my glass before his own, a small gesture that eased some of my tension. I quietly wondered if those rumors had ever been true at all. Throughout the meal, Lu Jing kept the conversation flowing naturally, asking about my hobbies and daily habits. He never once brought up the arranged marriage or the debt between our two families, as if this were simply an ordinary meal between two new acquaintances. Noticing I seemed to like the steamed fish, he added a large piece to my bowl without a word. I fumbled a little at the unexpected gesture, murmured thanks, and kept eating. He watched my reaction for a moment, the corner of his mouth lifting into a faint, hard-to-notice smile, seemingly pleased by my shy response. I was about to decline the extra piece of fish, worried about eating too much in front of a stranger. Before I could speak, Lu Jing noticed my hesitation and gave a light, reassuring smile. "Just eat naturally. No need to stand on ceremony with me." His tone was gentle but firm, without a trace of pressure. I looked up at him, surprised by how easily he'd read and diffused my discomfort with just a glance. I nodded and picked up my chopsticks, finishing the still warm fish in my bowl. The atmosphere between us grew noticeably more natural compared to the tension when we'd first sat down. After the meal, Lu Jing personally walked me all the way to my car, his courtesy nothing but genuine. Before I got in, he suddenly stopped, his expression turning more serious. "I heard about how unfairly your family has treated you over the years." I froze, not expecting him to know something so private about me. He continued, his tone firm and unwavering. "Things will be different with me." The simple line stirred an unfamiliar feeling in my chest. I bowed my head in thanks, unsure how to respond to such unexpected consideration. Riding home in the car, I leaned my head against the window, watching the city lights slide by. Lu Jing's last words kept echoing in my mind the whole way back. In 15 years, no one had ever genuinely cared about my feelings the way he just had, not even the family who had raised me. I had already braced myself for a cold, dutiful arranged marriage, purely for family obligation. But the look in his eyes, the tone of his voice at that parting moment, stirred a faint, hesitant hope in me, even as I wasn't sure I should trust that feeling at all. From the day we met, Lu Jing started texting me every day, even if just simple check-ins. "Have you eaten yet?" Or "Go to bed early, don't stay up too late." I wasn't used to such consistent attention. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a little flustered, unsure how to respond. Some days, caught up in housework, I'd leave his messages unread for half a day. Worried he'd be annoyed by the delay, I rushed to apologize. But his reply surprised me, gentle and free of any of the reproach I'd expected. Lu Jing's message appeared on my screen, his tone as calm as ever. No need to apologize. If you're busy, just leave it, reply whenever you're free. I stared at those words for a long while, a hard-to-describe relief spreading through me. Before, whenever I was slow with anything at home, all I ever got back was reproach or cold sarcasm. This was the first time anyone had told me it was fine, that I didn't have to bend over backward to please them. I typed a short thank you, my palms warming strangely at the sight of the screen. One afternoon, I was carrying a stack of books down the stairs to the living room when a sudden shove from behind knocked me off balance. I tumbled down the last few steps, books scattering across the floor. Pain shot through my wrist where I'd caught myself, and looking up, I saw Su Ang standing on the stairs, feigning shock. "Oh, did you trip?" I was just standing nearby. His tone carried not a shred of real guilt. I swallowed the pain, forced myself up, and gathered the scattered books without arguing or calling out his blatant lie in front of the housekeeper who'd come running. Somehow the news reached Lu Jing that very evening. Within the hour, his car screeched to a stop outside the Su family villa, his footsteps urgent as he strode straight into the living room where the family was having dinner. His expression was chillingly cold, eyes sweeping sharply over everyone. "Who hurt Su Chen's wrist?" His voice was low, but carried enough weight to silence the whole table instantly. Su Ang bowed his head, mumbling a fake apology for the accident. Our parents rushed to smooth things over, but Lu Jing had no intention of letting it go so easily. Lu Jing stood tall, his gaze sweeping the table before settling on my father. "From now on, Su Chen belongs to the Lu family. Anyone who dares bully him again will answer to me." The short, sharp statement left no one at the table daring to say a word. He turned to me, his eyes softening instantly, his tone shifting to something gentle. "Let's go. I'll take you to get that wrist checked." Dazed, I stood and followed him, and before I could react, he'd already taken my good hand and pulled me straight toward the door, under the family's stunned stares. In the car on the way to the hospital, I bowed my head, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Lu Jing drove with one hand, the other gently resting on my head, the tenderness catching me off guard. "Next time, don't endure it alone. Tell me if anything happens." His voice was warm, without a hint of blame directed at me. I looked out the window, warmth spreading through my chest in a way I'd never felt before. In 15 years living in that house, no one had ever stood up to protect me as fiercely and decisively as the man sitting beside me now. At the hospital, the doctor examined and carefully wrapped my wrist, concluding it was just a mild sprain that would heal with a few days' rest. After the doctor left, Lu Jing still wasn't satisfied, undoing the bandage and rewrapping it himself, his movements slow and meticulous down to every detail. I sat watching those large but skilled hands tend to my injury, an unfamiliar feeling stirring in my chest. The doctor already finished. I said softly, reminding him. He didn't look up, just answered curtly, "I'm doing it again to make sure." On the way back, I couldn't hold back a question that had been on my mind and asked him quietly, "Why are you so good to me? We've barely known each other." Lu Jing's hand faltered slightly on the wheel, then he turned to look at me, the corner of his mouth curling into a rare, gentle smile. "Because I like you, it's that simple." The straightforward answer, no hedging at all, made my heart skip a beat. I lowered my head, unsure how to respond to such sudden sincerity. A question crossed my mind, whether this affection was truly meant for me, or just a sense of duty from a man facing an arranged marriage between two families. A few days later, Su Han unexpectedly texted asking me to meet at a quiet cafe, his tone far more serious than usual. He sat across from me, his gaze thoughtful and searching. "Su Chen, do you actually want to marry Lu Jing, or do you just feel like you have no other choice?" The sudden question caught me off guard for a moment before I answered honestly. "I've never really thought about love. This is just the first time I've felt like someone truly wanted to protect me." Su Han studied me in silence for a long moment, his expression complicated, as if weighing something important before deciding whether to say more. Su Han turned his coffee cup in his hands, finally speaking, his voice dropping low. "I'm not against you marrying Lu Jing. It's just something's felt off lately." I frowned, waiting for him to continue, a faint unease stirring inside me. He paused, then went on, glancing around the cafe as if wary of being overheard. "Aunt Su Rong's been asking me strange questions about your engagement to the Lu family, not normal curiosity." I filed the warning away, but didn't think much of it at the time, assuming she was simply overly invested as usual. I answered Su Han with a faint smile, trying to reassure both him and myself. "She's probably just curious. It is a big deal for the family after all." Su Han nodded, though his expression hadn't fully shed its worry, and he gave me a few more reminders to watch my words carefully around outsiders, especially during this sensitive time before the wedding. I took his words to heart, though I still didn't pay them much mind. The meeting ended, and the two of us parted ways in the parking lot, Su Han patting my shoulder gently before leaving, his eyes still carrying a trace of unspoken thought. A few days later, Lu Jing took me to a high-end jewelry store to pick out wedding rings, the space luxurious and quiet, reserved just for the two of us. He stood beside me patiently for hours, asking my opinion on every smallest detail, from the design to the thickness of the band. I wasn't familiar with any of this, mostly just nodding along with the salesperson's suggestions. But Lu Jing insisted I choose according to my own genuine taste, refusing to let me settle for someone else's preference out of old habit. In the end, I picked a simple, elegant ring that matched my naturally understated style. The night before the formal engagement ceremony, my phone lit up with a long message from Lu Jing, unlike his usual short check-ins. He wrote that even though this marriage had started as an arrangement between two families, he wanted me to know his feelings for me were completely genuine. He promised to always stand by my side, no matter what happened. I read the message over and over, my finger tracing lightly across the screen, a warm feeling rising in my chest, hard to put into words. For the first time in my life, I felt truly cherished and chosen by someone. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, standing in front of the mirror examining the traditional outfit prepared for the engagement ceremony. My chest was a tangle of emotions, hard to name, both nervous and anxious ahead of the new chapter about to open in my life. Mom came in to help adjust my collar, her expression briefly complicated, but she said nothing more. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, telling myself that even though this marriage began out of family obligation, I could still allow myself to hope for something better waiting ahead, beside the man who had been gently protecting me all this time. The engagement ceremony went far more smoothly than I'd imagined. The Lu family was courteous, Lu Jing's parents welcoming me with a warmth completely unlike the coldness I was used to at home. What surprised me even more was my own family's behavior that day. My parents unusually cheerful, constantly praising me in front of the in-laws. Su Han stood beside me the whole time, occasionally glancing at me with an unreadable look. The excessive cheerfulness made me uneasy, a vague sense of unease creeping in without any clear reason to explain it. The wedding was set for a month out, a tight timeline, but Lu Jing personally handled every last detail. He picked the venue himself, reviewed every invitation design, even asked my opinion on flower colors despite his packed work schedule. Some days he'd bring a thick catalog to my office just so I could look through it during a short lunch break. The care behind it all moved me deeply. No one had ever put so much effort into something because of me. The closer we got to the wedding, the more clearly I felt the sincerity behind every small gesture of his. The wedding took place in an elegant venue, the hall packed with guests. I stood on stage in a pure white outfit, gripping Lu Jing's hand tight amid thunderous applause. Amid the bustling crowd, my eyes accidentally caught a shadowed corner where Su Ang stood watching, his expression unreadable, not quite joy, not quite envy either. I faltered for a beat at that look, but Lu Jing quickly drew my attention back with a whisper in my ear. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on savoring this important moment of my life. On our wedding night, I sat on the edge of the bed in our new bedroom, my palms slightly sweaty with nerves. Lu Jing walked over and sat gently beside me without a hint of the urgency I'd feared. He wrapped his arms around me softly, chin resting on top of my head. No rush. We'll wait until you're truly ready. His voice was warm, without a trace of pressure. I leaned into his solid chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my ear, a sense of safety I'd never felt before spreading through my body on our first official night together. I officially moved into the Lu family villa right after the wedding. The house was spacious, natural light flooding every room, a world away from the gloomy coldness I'd known for 15 years. The household staff were warm and welcoming, treating me with genuine respect rather than forced politeness. Lu Jing spent an entire evening showing me around every corner of the house, introducing each room in detail, asking how I wanted to decorate my own private study. For the first time, I felt what a real home was supposed to feel like, a place where I was heard and respected, not just merely existing. A few days later, Lu Jing took me to the bank and personally helped me open an independent account in my own name. He transferred in a substantial sum, patiently explaining how to manage spending and track the balance, as gently as if teaching a child the basics. I stared at the number on the screen, stunned by the unexpected generosity. That's too much, I can't take all this. I protested weakly, my hand trembling slightly as I held the brand new bank card. Lu Jing just smiled, patted my shoulder reassuringly, his eyes free of any calculation or hidden condition. I was still hesitant, trying to find a way to decline the large sum, feeling I hadn't done anything to deserve it. Lu Jing looked at me seriously, his tone growing firmer. This is your rightful due as my spouse, not charity or a favor from me. The statement stopped me cold. No one had ever explained so clearly and respectfully what I deserved. For 15 years in the Su household, I'd grown used to having to be grateful for every little thing I received. Now Lu Jing was teaching me an entirely different lesson about my own worth. Every weekend, Lu Jing devoted all his time to taking me around the city, to places I'd never once had the chance to visit before. We went to art museums, strolled along the riverside park, tried unfamiliar street food I'd always been curious about but never dared try. Throughout our outings, he held my hand tightly, never letting go even for a moment amid the crowded streets. I grew used to that warm presence beside me, no longer feeling the stiffness of our earlier days together. Those simple moments gradually became the thing I looked forward to most each week. Gradually, I began daring to voice small wishes of my own that I'd never dared share with anyone before. Once, passing an old bookshop, I unconsciously stopped, staring into the window display for a long moment. Lu Jing noticed right away and without waiting for an explanation, pulled me inside by the hand. I fumbled to decline out of old habit, but he just smiled gently and let me freely pick out any book I liked. The feeling of being allowed to want something for myself without fear of judgment or rejection warmed my chest in a strange, unfamiliar way. I began to believe I deserved happiness, even in these small, simple ways. One evening, sitting together on the sofa, I found myself telling Lu Jing about Su Ang's disappearance years ago, back when I was only 8. He listened closely, never interrupting, occasionally asking for specific details about the timing, the location, and the search that followed. I told the story calmly, long accustomed to recounting this old memory as an unerasable part of my past. Lu Jing stayed silent for a long while after I finished, his eyes turning thoughtful, as if weighing something important he wasn't ready to share with me yet. I didn't notice the subtle shift in Lu Jing's expression when I mentioned how the DNA match had come back so quickly after 15 years of silence. He just nodded slightly, continuing to listen to the rest of my story without letting any unusual reaction show on his face. At the time, I simply saw it as a sad story from the past, never once imagining something suspicious might be hiding behind Su Ang's fortunate return. I leaned my head against his shoulder, relieved that someone had finally listened to my whole story from start to finish. Lu Jing gently stroked my hair, his voice softly shifting the conversation elsewhere with practiced ease. "That's all in the past now. Don't think about it too much, you have me here now." He pulled me into his arms, his hand rubbing soothing circles on my back in a familiar, comforting rhythm. I nestled obediently against him, unaware of the faint, contemplative look still lingering in his eyes there in the darkened room. I slept better that night than any night since moving into the Lu household, with no idea at all that the man holding me had already begun quietly paying close attention to the strange details surrounding Su Ang's return. A few weeks later, I started noticing Lu Jing was away from home more often, sometimes not walking into our bedroom until well past midnight. Whenever I asked, he'd just answer vaguely that work at the company had gotten busier lately, without going into any specifics. I didn't suspect much, simply assuming that, as the head of a large corporation, he had to face endless work pressure every day. Some nights I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find his side of the bed still empty, the study light downstairs still on late into the night, casting a faint glow up onto the ceiling. One afternoon, I brought a cup of tea down to Lu Jing's private study, meaning to leave it on his desk for a break. As I set the cup down, my eyes caught a thick file open on the desk, a small label on the cover bearing the name of a private testing lab I'd seen before. I paused, unsure why my husband would be interested in this kind of file, but before I could look closer, I heard his footsteps approaching the door. I quickly left the room, a vague, nameless suspicion settling in my chest. Su Rong, my aunt who now served as the Su Group's chief financial officer, unexpectedly dropped by the Lu family villa one weekend afternoon. She brought gifts, greeting me warmly, her attentiveness catching me off guard since she'd never been particularly close to me before. As we talked, her eyes kept sweeping the room, lingering a bit too long on Lu Jing's private work corner as if searching for something specific. I didn't think much of it at the time, simply entertaining her with the usual courtesy owed to a relative. That night, I told Lu Jing about Su Rong's unusual visit, including how her eyes had lingered on his workspace. He listened closely, nodding slightly but offering no comment, his expression turning harder to read than usual. I asked if something was wrong, and he just smiled reassuringly, stroking my hair and telling me not to worry too much. But I could still sense a tension hidden behind that smile, a vague feeling that something significant was quietly unfolding, something I hadn't yet been told about. A few days later, Su Han urgently asked to meet me at a quiet cafe, his expression unusually tense. He lowered his voice and told me he'd recently discovered Su Rong had made several large transfers to an unfamiliar private testing lab entirely outside the company's official spending. He said the pattern of transfers was highly unusual, unlike any legitimate business transaction he'd seen before. I sat listening quietly, an uneasy feeling growing as the scattered details slowly began piecing together into something suspicious. I asked Su Han, my voice trembling with confusion. "You think Su Ang isn't really my brother?" Su Han sighed, his expression complicated at the direct question. "I can't say for certain yet. It's just that everything happening lately is too strange and we need more solid proof." He warned me to keep quiet about this for now, careful not to let any hint of suspicion show in front of Su Ang or Su Rong. I nodded in agreement, weighed down by the thought that my 15 years of blame might have stemmed from a deliberate scheme from the very start. Back home that night, unable to hide my unease, I told Lu Jing the whole conversation with Su Han. He listened quietly to the end, then let out a soft sigh, finally confessing something he'd been keeping to himself. "I've been quietly investigating this for weeks now, ever since the night you told me about the disappearance years ago." I stared at him, stunned he'd already been acting on this for so long without breathing a word to me. He gripped my hand tight, his eyes resolute. "I just wanted solid proof before worrying you any further." Lu Jing led me into his study and pulled out a thick file he'd been quietly gathering all this time. Inside was evidence that the original DNA sample used to verify Su Ang had been swapped right at the very testing lab Su Rong frequented. I looked at the documents, my hands shaking uncontrollably, my mind reeling at the possibility I'd been wrongly blamed for 15 long years because of a deliberate scheme from the start. Lu Jing squeezed my hand, his voice steady. I don't have enough evidence to act yet, but I promise I'll bring the whole truth to light before making anything public. While continuing to dig through every record related to Su Ang to gather full evidence, Lu Jing stumbled upon an old security camera recording, carefully hidden away in the Su family's private archive for 15 years. The footage captured the exact fateful afternoon Su Ang went missing at the downtown park, all those years ago. He watched it over and over, his expression growing steadily more grave with each replay. He called me into the study at once, his voice carrying a hard-to-hide emotion. You need to see this first. It might change everything you've believed for all these years. I sat in front of the screen, my hands trembling as Lu Jing pressed play on the old, time-worn footage. In the video, I clearly saw myself at 8 years old, sitting and playing in a different corner of the park, far from where Su Ang had gone missing. A woman in a nanny's uniform left her post right before the incident happened, leaving the child alone amid the crowd. I sat stunned, unable to believe what I was seeing after 15 years. I'd been carrying blame for a truth entirely different from what my whole family had always assumed. Lu Jing pulled me into a tight embrace as he saw me trembling, unable to hold back the overwhelming emotion rising in me. He gently soothed me, his voice warm and reassuring. I'll find that nanny, gather full evidence before making anything public with your family. I nodded, tears still lingering at the corners of my eyes, a mix of relief and lingering pain washing over me. 15 years of wrongful blame were finally about to have an answer, though I also realized clearly that the real mystery of where Su Ang had truly disappeared still remained unresolved, with no lead pointing toward a final answer. A few days later, I noticed Su Ang had grown noticeably more wary whenever he ran into me around the house. He probed indirectly about my relationship with Su Rong, asking if I kept in frequent contact with her, his sharp eyes tracking every small shift in my expression. I feigned ignorance, answering vaguely out of old habit, careful not to let any unusual signs slip through under his scrutiny. Su Ang studied me a few more seconds, seemingly still unconvinced by my dismissive answer, but ultimately didn't push further. I tried to keep a calm expression as usual, going about my routine as if I knew nothing about the secret slowly being unraveled behind the scenes. Deep down, I understood that even one small slip could tip off Su Ang and Su Rong, giving them time to erase every trace before Lu Jing had gathered enough evidence. At every family meal, I kept behaving politely and passively as always, letting nothing show in my eyes or gestures. That forced calm exhausted me more than ever, but I understood it was the price I had to pay for the truth to finally come out in full. One late night, I happened to pass by the living room and overheard Su Ang on the phone with someone, his voice urgent and anxious. If this ever comes out, you have to get me out of it first. I don't want anything to do with the fallout. I froze against the wall, heart pounding, straining to hear more, but the call ended quickly. He walked out of the living room looking tense, nearly bumping into me standing nearby. I quickly bowed my head and pretended to walk past, my heart still racing from what I'd just overheard. I slipped quietly back to my room, hands shaking as I grabbed my phone and immediately sent the recording of the call I'd just caught to Lu Jing, along with a detailed account of what I'd heard. Just minutes later, my phone rang with a call from him, his voice unusually serious. This evidence is important. You did well. He told me to stay calm, keep behaving normally over the next few days and not let anything unusual show. I nodded even though he couldn't see it, both anxious and hopeful for the day the whole truth would finally come out in front of the entire family. A few days later, Lu Jing told me the evidence was now strong enough to act on, including the recording of Su Ang's call, the swapped DNA records, and the old security footage they'd just found. He decided to make everything public that week, unable to delay any longer for fear Su Rong would erase her tracks if word got out. He gripped my hand tight, his eyes resolute, as if steadying both me and himself. Tomorrow, I'll call an unexpected family meeting. Are you ready to face the truth with me? I nodded firmly, without a shred of hesitation left. The next morning, Lu Jing personally arranged a surprise family meeting at the Su family villa, bringing along his own lawyer and an independent forensic expert. The whole Su family looked bewildered by the sudden gathering, unsure why their son-in-law would arrange such a formal meeting. Our parents, Su Han and Su Ang, were all present in the spacious living room, each pair of eyes carrying a different flicker of worry. I sat beside Lu Jing, my hands clasped tightly together, trying to stay calm before the important moment about to unfold. Lu Jing stood up, his voice ringing out sharp and clear through the suffocating silence of the room. I have proof that Su Ang has no blood relation to the Su family whatsoever. The whole living room fell dead silent for a moment, no one able to believe what they'd just heard. The forensic expert immediately presented the official DNA comparison results, confirming the person sitting before them shared no bloodline with anyone in the Su family. Su Ang went pale, hands gripping the edge of his chair, trying to stay composed even as his eyes betrayed sharp panic at the truth now exposed in front of everyone. Mom stood up trembling, hands over her mouth, unable to speak in the face of the truth just announced. Dad slammed his hand on the table, his face flushed with anger and shock at once, his voice booming through the living room. Who's behind this? Who dared plan such a monstrous scheme? Su Han sat still, fists clenched, his eyes darting towards Su Rong sitting stiffly in the corner of the room. The air in the living room grew so thick you could hear everyone's ragged breathing. Su Rong shot to her feet, her voice cracking as she tried to deny the accusations piling up against her. I have absolutely nothing to do with this. Don't you dare accuse me falsely. Lu Jing said nothing more, simply pulling out his phone and playing the recording of the call between Su Ang and a woman whose voice matched Su Rong's perfectly. The recording played clearly through the dead silence of the room, exposing all the anxiety and scheming between the two of them in the face of exposure. Su Rong's face turned ashen, with no words left to defend herself. The full truth was finally laid bare in front of the whole family. Su Rong, using her position as the group's chief financial officer, had conspired with a private testing lab to fake the DNA results, orchestrating an entire fake Su Ang to seize the inheritance and gradually manipulate the company from within. The plan had been carefully prepared over many months before finally bringing the long-lost son home flawlessly, without a single flaw. Our parents, hearing this, seemed to collapse into their seats, unable to believe someone in their own family could plan something so cruel purely out of greed for power and money. Su Ang finally broke down completely under the mounting pressure from every side, dropping to his knees on the floor, his voice trembling as he confessed the truth. I'm just an orphan Su Rong found and trained for years to pose as the family's lost son. He recounted the entire process of being taught how to behave, how to memorize every small detail about the Su family so he'd never slip up during all his time living with them. The living room sank into heavy silence, every eye fixed on the confessed culprit kneeling and trembling on the cold floor. Amid the chaos, Dad turned to look at me, his expression complicated as if about to say something. But before he could speak, Lu Jing stepped forward and played another video on the large screen in the living room. It was the old security footage from 15 years ago, clearly showing the nanny leaving her post right before Su Ang truly disappeared from the park. This is the truth of what really happened that day. It was never Chen's fault. The living room shook again at this second wave of unexpected evidence being brought to light. The truth behind the old disappearance was finally laid bare in front of the whole family. The nanny back then, afraid of losing her job and her income, had shifted all the blame onto me, an 8-year-old child who never should have had to bear such a heavy consequence. Our parents had believed her account immediately, without ever properly investigating, letting me carry the weight of blame and coldness for 15 relentless years. Mom broke down sobbing, hands trembling over her face, unable to face the cruel truth just laid bare before everyone present. Not long after, the sound of police sirens echoed outside the villa gates. Exactly as Lu Jing had arranged, police entered the living room and read Su Rong her rights, arresting her on charges of forgery and organized fraud against the family's assets. Su Ang was taken in too to assist with the investigation, though his role in the scheme had been more coerced than orchestrated. The whole family stood frozen, watching the two of them led away in handcuffs, no one able to say a word at the scene unfolding right inside their own home. News of the scandal spread across social media within hours. The public discovered that the Su group had actually known Su Ang was a fraud all along, yet still openly granted inheritance shares to someone with no blood relation to the family whatsoever. Articles and comments piled on with sharp criticism, questioning the real motive behind such a calculated cover-up. Our parents hadn't anticipated a public backlash this fierce. Within a short time, the family's reputation had already taken serious damage. Shareholders and the public alike voiced outrage together, arguing this wasn't simply a case of being deceived, but a deliberate cover-up meant to profit the family. Numerous online analyses pointed out the absurdity of the family never properly verifying things before publicly granting such a large inheritance to a newcomer. Pressure from shareholders and the public mounted by the hour, forcing company leadership to call an emergency meeting to handle the escalating PR crisis. Faced with an ever-growing wave of criticism, one longtime business partner after another announced the end of their partnerships with the Su group, citing serious loss of trust in the current leadership's competence and integrity. In less than a week, the reputation the Su family had built over decades had nearly collapsed entirely in the public eye. Our parents received call after call from former partners announcing their withdrawal, each voice colder and firmer than the last. The villa that once rang with laughter now sat wrapped in a heavy, unsettling silence. Under pressure that couldn't be reversed, our parents finally had no choice but to officially resign from every executive position at the company, stepping back entirely from the business to ease some of the public and shareholder outrage. Su Han, despite his youth and lack of management experience, stepped up to temporarily take over the company, working to stabilize the chaos unfolding day by day. I stood watching quietly as the family that once cast me aside now fell apart under the consequences of its own making, feeling not a trace of the satisfaction I once thought I'd feel. A few days after the fallout, Mom called me, her voice breaking with emotion through every word. She apologized for having believed the nanny's word for 15 years without ever properly investigating, letting me bear the blame and coldness of the whole family for all that time. Her voice trembled, broken sobs slipping through the call that she couldn't hold back. I listened quietly to her belated apology, no longer feeling the sharp resentment I once had, but unable to recover the close bond a mother and son were supposed to share either. I answered her gently but firmly, not wanting to drag out the emotionally heavy call any longer. I don't blame you and Dad anymore, but I don't think we can go back to how things were. Silence stretched on the other end of the line, just the sound of her heavy sigh drifting through the phone. She didn't try to persuade or hold on any further, seeming to understand too that the distance between us had grown too wide to mend with a few simple apologies. The call ended in heavy silence from both sides. A week later, Dad texted asking to meet me in person to apologize face to face. I thought it over for a long while before agreeing, finally choosing a quiet little cafe tucked in a quiet alley as the meeting place. I arrived early, sitting by the window watching the small street outside, my chest still tangled with mixed emotions ahead of this meeting with the man who had been my father for 15 years. A few minutes later, I saw him appear at the end of the alley, his steps slower and heavier than usual. Dad sat down across from me, not ordering anything, just lowering his head deeply before me. "I'm sorry, son," just those few short words with no further explanation or excuse attached. I looked at him, a tangle of complicated feelings stirring inside, a mix of bitterness and a faint, hard-to-name relief. I nodded slightly in response, saying nothing more. Dad sat in silence for a few more minutes before standing, bowing his head one last time before quietly walking away, asking for nothing more from me. Of the whole old family, only Su-Han kept in regular touch with me after the fallout. He'd text occasionally to check in on my life, sometimes updating me on the company gradually stabilizing under his temporary leadership. I answered his messages gently too, no longer keeping the distance I once had. Our relationship as brothers had become simpler and more genuine, free from the family pressures and constant comparisons that had once weighed on us for so many years. That was perhaps the one thing from my old family I truly still cherished. Sensing I still hadn't fully processed the emotional weight of everything that had happened, Lu Jing arranged a long getaway for the two of us, far from the noisy city and all the trouble we'd just been through. He chose a quiet seaside resort where only the steady sound of waves and fresh air surrounded us. Throughout the trip, he stayed by my side, never pushing or asking too many questions, just quietly keeping me company and letting me enjoy this rare stretch of peace in my own way. One afternoon, I sat by the shore with Lu Jing, watching the sunset sink into the water in brilliant shades of orange. I spoke to him softly, my voice more sincere than ever. I never thought there'd come a day I could live without having to please anyone or hold myself back. Lu Jing turned to look at me, his eyes full of genuine warmth and admiration. He said nothing right away, just quietly wrapped his arms around me from behind, chin resting gently on my shoulder, and together we savored that rare, peaceful moment by the vast sea. Lu Jing tightened his arms around me, his voice warm against my ear over the steady sound of the waves. From now on, you just need to live well for yourself. I'll take care of everything else and keep you safe. I leaned into his solid chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, a deep sense of safety I'd never had in 15 years living under that old roof of blame and coldness. I closed my eyes, letting the cool sea breeze wash over my face, savoring this rare, peaceful, happy moment beside the man I loved. A few months after that trip, I decided to bring to life a small dream I'd quietly held onto for a long time but never dared pursue. I opened a small bookshop on a quiet street near our home, arranging the shelves entirely to my own taste, with no need to accommodate anyone else's expectations anymore. Lu Jing became my very first regular customer, stopping by every morning, always ordering a hot coffee and sitting quietly reading in his usual corner while I opened up the shop for the day. Late one night, after closing up the bookshop, I came home and was pulled into a tight embrace from behind the moment I stepped through the door. Lu Jing whispered against my ear, his voice warm and full of deep, genuine feeling. "Thank you for choosing to stay with me through all of it." I smiled softly, leaning fully into his familiar chest, feeling warmth and peace spread through my whole body. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was truly just the beginning of a full, happy life, one where I could finally be myself without having to hold back or endure anything ever again. 15 years, and a 4-word apology from an adoptive father was meant to make up for everything I'd carried. Some would say forgiveness is the only way to move forward, while others believe some wrongs shouldn't be wiped away by a simple, "I'm sorry, son." If it were you, once you knew the truth, would you choose to forgive and let it go, or keep your distance for good from a family that once turned its back on you?